We're beginning Chapter 9, Hard Sell, of Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare by Peter C. Goetze. The drug industry is unique in that it can make exploitation appear a noble purpose. Former medical director of Squibb at the U.S. Senate hearing. At a U.S. Senate hearing. The clinical trials are marketing in disguise. Whatever the industry does, whatever it calls it, and whatever it says about its noble motives, it all boils down to one thing: selling drugs. This is done very effectively by tightly controlling the flow and type of information about its drugs, both in scientific papers and in marketing. Its clinical trials are rarely research in the true sense of the word. It is marketing disguised as research. The trials are often flawed by design. Additional flaws are introduced during data analysis, and the misleading results are spun to make sure that whatever an honest trial might have shown, the trial concludes something that is useful for boosting sales. My thesis showed that what the industry publishes just cannot be true. I identified 196 double-blind trials where a new non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, an SAID, had been compared with a control NSAID in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. This is a highly variable disease, which makes it difficult to find differences between two similar drugs. But despite this, the trials were microscopically small, with a median sample size of only 27 patients in each group. One would therefore expect virtually all statistically significant differences in effect to have arisen by chance. In other words, 5% of the differences would be statistically significant, 2.5% in favor of the new drug and 2.5% in the favor of the control drug. However, 14% of the differences, or 3 times as many as expected, were statistically significant, and in 73 trials, all differences favored the new drug compared with only 8 trials that favored the control drug. It was rarely possible to check the statistical analyses, but I found 12 trials where the claimed statistically significant differences were not statistically significant, and 5 trials where I strongly suspected it. In all 17 cases, the false significant findings favored the new drug. The results for side effects were even more striking. In all 39 trials with a significant difference in side effects, this difference favored the new drug. Thus, the new NSAIDs appeared to be considerably better than the old ones, and the spin in the conclusion or abstract was even more formidable. In 81 cases, the biased conclusion favored the new drug, and in only 1 case did the conclusion favor the control drug. P equals 3.4 times 10 to the negative 23rd power. Okay. However, when I looked at the data presented as means in papers, the impressive superiority of new drugs disappeared. The most common outcome was grip strength, and there was no difference between new drugs and controlled drugs on average. The reason that the most important outcome When the two NSAIDs are being compared with the drug, the patients prefer the crossover trials where they try both drugs in random order. The patients are surely the best judges for weighing a certain degree of pain relief against the side effects of the drugs. Most trials had used indomethacin as comparator, an old drug marketed in 1963, which, according to industry myths and flawed trials, had many side effects. However, in indomethacin crossover trials, the patients preferred indomethacin about equally often as the new NSAID. The figure shows, and figure 9.1, the figure shows that the larger trial, I'll just show you the figure so you know what I'm talking about. Pause to see what you, better pause. The figure shows that the larger the trial, the less the variation in the difference between the two drugs. This is expected from statistical theory when we randomize rather few patients. There will sometimes be more patients with a good prognosis in the indomethacin group than in the other group, and sometimes there will be more patients with a poor prognosis. When we randomize many patients, the groups will be very similar and the result therefore more precise than in a small trial. We expect the results from many similar trials to lie within a symmetric funnel, and this is also the case, apart from two results that are so outlying that fraud must be suspected. Figure 9.1, difference in proportion of patients preferring a new NSAID and proportion preferring indomethacin therapeutic gain in 34 crossover trials. Arrows mark two outlying key fraudulent trials. 2 of 32 trials is a high fraud rate, 6%. But when I showed the graph to a colleague from industry, he laughed and said that everybody knew that about 5% of trials were fraudulent. In other words, more or less made up. Data fabrication was so widespread in the drug industry that there was slang for it, dry labeling, or graphiting in the United States and making in Japan. When I defended my thesis in 1990, the two examiners felt that NSAIDs were a particularly bad area because there was so much competition on the market. My results were too shocking for them to fully realize what they meant. Since then, however, we have seen similar problems in all therapeutic areas that have been thoroughly investigated. Lipid-lowering drugs is another example of a highly competitive market. In a head-to-head statins trial, there is often no blinding, no concealment of treatment allocation, which means that the randomization could have been violated, poor follow-up, and no intention to treat analysis, where the fate of all randomized patients are accounted for, also those who drop out. Funding from the test drug company rather than the comparator drug company was associated with more favorable results, odd ratio 20, and more favorable conclusion, odds ratio 35. This is not surprising considering that head-to-head statin trials are not fairly designed, as the compared doses in most of the trials are not equivalent. Further, there are no trials of good quality that have compared different statins for clinically relevant outcomes, such as coronary disease events. In contrast, no less than 29 placebo-controlled trials have reported on such events, which suggests that many of the trials were unethical as patients on placebo were denied an effective drug. That's what they did with fucking coronavirus. They ruined the control group by giving them the vaccine. So bye-bye data. Looking at it from a helicopter perspective, the Cochrane review that included 48 papers that in total comprised thousands of individual trials found that industry-sponsored studies more often had favorable efficacy results, favorable harm results, and favorable conclusions for the drug or medical device of interest, compared with non-industry sponsored studies. The industry's many tricks make the impossible possible. It is very rare that the title of a paper tells you everything you need to know, but here is an example. Why olazapine beats risperidone. Risperidone beats quetiapine, and quetiapine beats olazapine. An exploratory analysis of head-to-head comparison studies of second-generation antipsychotics. In a mathematical sense, this shouldn't be possible. If A is higher than B and B is higher than C, then C cannot be higher than A. Ghostwriting. The misleading information in original research papers is subsequently propagated in scores of ghostwritten reviews and other secondary articles. Ghostwriting is very harmful to public health as it misleads doctors about the benefits and harms of drugs. It is also fraud as doctors are deceived deliberately, the very purpose of not informing the readers about who wrote the paper is to make it appear as if it came from disinterested, prominent academics and not from a corporate sponsor. Ghostwritten papers are subsequently cited in promotional materials and in other ghost papers, as if they provide independent verification that the drug is effective and safe and better than other drugs. Thus, marketing people produce ghost papers that are used by the same marketing people. A perfect incestuous way of fooling unsuspecting doctors into believing what they think their own leaders have written. If deceit wasn't intended, we would expect the company to tell us who the writer was. Make it clear that the writer was paid and commissioned to do the work, and publish the paper in that writer's name. Instead, companies go to great lengths to find academics that cover up the scam with their names and omit any mentioning of the medical writer's contribution, even in the acknowledgement. The academics get paid for their non-work and may receive a letter offering them tens of thousands of dollars simply to add their names to a review they have never seen that praises the company's new drug. Ghostwriting corrupts the trust that is so essential for scientific communication. It's looked like a win-win situation for the doctors and the company that share an interest in not telling anyone about the arrangement, but lawsuits have made it possible for everyone to get a glimpse of the dirty business. I shall first describe how common the practice is. A study of papers on the antidepressant drug sertraline, Zoloft, Pfizer shows that in a 3-year period, 55 papers had been written by medical writing agency, Current Medical Directions, whereas only 41 papers had been written by other people. Only 2 of the 55 papers acknowledged writing support from people not listed as authors, and all results were favorable for Pfizer. In 2007, the International Study of Medical Planning Professionals included a workshop at its annual meeting where a consultant warned of the dangers of regulators seeking publication plans. If they looked at a publication strategy that, I don't know, had, we're going to put out 80 papers this year on one drug, all off label. 50 of those will be review articles where we'll pay someone to write about off label use. We had access to both the protocol and the publication of 44 industry initiated trials and used our sample to study ghostwriting. We didn't find any trial protocol or publication that stated explicitly that the clinical study report or the manuscript was to be written or written by the clinical investigators, and none of the protocols stated that clinical investigators were to be involved with data analysis. We found evidence of ghost authorship of 75% of trials, which increased to 91% when we included cases where a person qualifying for authorship was acknowledged rather than appearing as an author. In most trials, the ghost authors we identified were statisticians, but we likely overlooked others as we had very limited information to identify the possible omission of other people who would have quantified as authors, who would have qualified as authors. The trial protocol is an important document, but only 5 protocols explicitly identified the author. None of these people, all of whom were company employees, were listed as authors of the publications or were thanked in the acknowledgments, even though one protocol noted that the author of this protocol will be included in the list of authors. The ghost operates in complete darkness, it seems, and shy from the light. A good way of reducing the prevalence of ghosts and guests is to write in the paper who did what, like film credits. The idea was coined by Drummond Rainey in 1996. And The Lancet was the first journal to introduce it in 1997. Here is an example. Mr. Yank first conceived of and designed this study, collected, analyzed, and interpreted the data, and wrote the article. Dr. Rainey assisted with refining the concept and design, assisted with data collection, and critically revised the article for important intellectual content. According to internationally accepted criteria for authorship, persons listed as authors are required to have made all of the following substantial contributions. Number 1, conceive and designed the paper or analyzed and interpreted the data. Number 2, drafted the paper or revised it critically for important intellectual content. And number 3, approved the final version of the paper before publication. These criteria made it possible to study if authors of original research articles in Lancet papers deserved authorship. Although Yank et al. Used a very conservative definition of guest authors, 44% of authors did not fulfill these lenient criteria for authorship. Studies that rely on what people tell you will underestimate the problems because of social desirability bias. Nonetheless, one such study reported 13% ghost authorship of papers published in 6 major medical journals and 21% guest authorship. David Healy has described how frank some companies are toward doctors. We have had our ghostwriters produce a first draft based on your published work. I attached it here. When Healy was unhappy with the glowing review of a drug and suggested changes, the company replied that he had missed some commercially important points and published the paper in another academic's name. When a little light shines on the ghosts, it is usually in the form of XX provided editorial assistance, which means XX wrote the paper, and when only a trace of light comes through the shadows, we are told that the authors thank XX for help. With what? Cooking coffee while the overburdened clinicians analyze the data? Hardly. The marketing machine. With an abundance of flawed literature at hand, it is not difficult to let marketing do the final kill. And even without such literature, marketing works. What is likely the most notorious example for this in medical history is related to treatment of stomach ulcers. 50 years ago, ulcers were often treated by surgery, but James Black from the US company SmithKline and French invented cimetidine, a drug that reduces stomach acid. It came on the market in 1977 under the name Tagamet, and Black was awarded the Nobel Prize. The company's success was to be beaten by Paul Girolami, a financial controller who had worked his way to the top as CEO of the UK company Glaxo. Glaxo was mostly known for milk formulas for infants and had no operations in the United States. In 1983, Glaxo marketed a very similar drug, Ranitidine, Zantac, with a highly unusual strategy. Instead of offering a lower price than Tagamet, the price was about 50% higher to suggest to people that it was a better drug. It wasn't, but Girolami launched one of the most expensive and aggressive promotional campaigns ever seen. He hired drug salespeople who already worked for Hoffman LaRoche in the United States and literally exploded the ailment heartburn. Gallup was paid to survey Americans and dutifully came up with the result he wanted, that almost half of Americans suffered heartburn each month, which led to the campaign Heartburn Across America. Glaxo also hired a celebrity and actress who told the public how Zantac had helped her. Already 3 years after the launch, Zantac surpassed Tagamet in sales and became the best-selling drug on earth, and Girolami was knighted by Queen Elizabeth. This looked more like an evil plot concocted by an imaginative novel writer than reality. But unfortunately, it was real. And it showed to the world that even research at the Nobel Prize level couldn't beat marketing. It changed the drug industry forever after, as they say in fairy tales, and marked the beginning of an era with a terrible waste of taxpayers' money on industry marketing and very little innovation. Drug companies institutionalized deception, and Pfizer won the race to the ethical bottom. Right from its foundation in 1849, the company had shown a knack for getting people to take more medicine. So it's no surprise that Pfizer became the world's biggest drug company. When its CEO retired in 2000, he said that he recently bought a boat, but as he had nowhere to put it, he bought a marina too. The tight information control goes under the radar of most doctors, but their patients may think otherwise. My patient scanned the prescription I had handed her, then idly glanced at my elegant ballpoint pen I had used to sign it. The same brand name appeared on both. She said nothing, but I knew what she was thinking. General practitioners rely on the drug industry as their main information source. In one study, 86% of them reported seeing drug salespeople, and in Australia, 86% of the specialists had seen a drug salesperson within the last year. Free samples of drugs are usually left behind after such visits, and such samples are highly effective in getting doctors to use expensive drugs. This explains why the value of the samples amounted to about 1/4 of the industry's total marketing cost in 2004. It is a nice gesture to give away a pill box for free, but some doctors actually sell them to their patients or bill their government for them. Doctors are surprisingly naive, and they don't realize how much they are being manipulated. Most doctors believe the information they get from the industry is helpful for them. When interviewed, they question the objectivity of the industry, but nevertheless consider the information to be factually accurate and also feel able to separate credible from misleading information. The truth, which has been demonstrated in many research studies, is that doctors are not able to separate correct from misleading information. How could they when they are only presented with misleading information? Physicians believe that their actions are motivated by how good the drugs are, but studies have shown that their beliefs are more closely match marketing claims. A survey of 85 physicians, of which 1/3 were specialists in internal medicine, showed that 71% believed that impaired cerebral blood flow was a major cause of senile dementia, and 1/3 had found cerebral vasodilators useful in managing confused geriatric patients. Increasing blood flow, always a good thing, right? However, dementia isn't caused by impaired blood flow, and the drugs didn't work. Shows me, right? Half of these doctors also believe that a morphine derivative, propoxapine, is more effective than aspirin, although it's worse and hardly better than a placebo. I doubt that these same doctors would privately buy a washing machine that costs 10 times more than other machines just because the maker has compared it with the cheaper machines and claims that his machine is best. But healthcare is different. Doctors are not held financially accountable for their choices and often prescribe drugs that are 10 times or more expensive than older drugs. Although the only information they have comes from the manufacturer. Because marketing is so effective, industry spends vast amounts of money on it. Already 20 years ago, the industry spent $8,000 to $15,000 per physician every year in the United States. The current expenditure exceeds $1 billion a year in the United States. There is one salesperson per 5 office-based physicians, and 12% of a random sample of doctors had received financial incentives to participate in studies. You and I will pay for all of this through our taxes. We not only pay for the extravagant marketing, but also for reimbursement of the drugs because they are so expensive that people cannot afford them. We'll be back.